Boys and girls, welcome to lesson number 3 on immigration. This is a huge topic and has a tremendous amount of impact on understanding Britain 1951 to 1970 to 79, and to be honest, it has a huge impact on understanding Britain today. So before we get into immigration, to truly understand what we're talking about and why it happens the way it does, we need to understand the concept of the British Commonwealth. Now, the British Commonwealth is a group of countries that were formerly controlled by the British at the time of the Empire. For all intents and purposes, when India declares its independence, the British Empire ceases to exist as we knew it. The countries of the British Commonwealth meet frequently. They share similar ideals. Generally speaking, they maintain relatively close ties to Britain, sometimes socially, in other cases economically, but most importantly, they cover all areas of the world. You have members of the British Commonwealth in every continent, as you can see here on the map, indicated by the red and the pink colors. Now, the British Commonwealth is a relatively multicultural group of countries in 1950. You have black people from the West Indies, you have Indian and Asian people from Asia, you have, take Canada for instance, a wonderful country. You have a country that's, at this point anyway, predominantly white, but made up of white European immigrants. Australia, much the same. But you have a group of people that take over 800 million people on Earth are members of the British Commonwealth. But Britain itself, in 1951, is an incredibly white country. I mean, take a look at the example here. They have the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, and those are the British runners on the relay team right there. Every one of them is white. Contrast that to what we remember in the London Olympics in 2012, when our heroes, many of whom in the running, were black. Mo Farah himself came from Somalia, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Suter. And Britain, in 1951, is a white country. It's overwhelmingly so. There were many immigrants in Britain by 1960s, and only 200,000 of them were from the new Commonwealth countries, non-white countries.
So the big events, which has got a lot of press, and as you can see at the bottom, was even shown during the 2012 Olympics as a symbolic event, was the arrival of the SS Empire Windrush, or Windrush for short. Now this brought to England 492 West Indians from primarily Jamaica, but also the surrounding islands, Trinidad and Tobago in particular. And although that's not a great number, it's important symbolically. These were the first immigrants from the Commonwealth, particularly from the Caribbean, to arrive on British shores. And as we'll see in a second, they came in search of jobs, because the government actively tried to entice them over to fill gaps where in positions and roles which were essential for the country to run, but white working class people didn't want to do them for whatever reason. And although many other individuals came from all over the Commonwealth, and Windrush was only one boat, because it was the first one, it has a lot of symbolism. Okay, and these individuals who were aboard the Windrush were primarily young, male individuals without their families, without any children or any wives. This is in part because if you have no connection to a country, you are more likely to be able to go to a different country to find work. Whereas if you have a family, or if you're elderly, or you've got an established job, you are of course going to stay at home or stay in your native country. Whereas if you're a young male and single, it's an exciting opportunity. You've got nothing holding you back. And as we'll see in a second, these men who arrived were creative of a mixture of prejudice and curiosity.
Now, the major reason why people decided to come over here en masse in the 1950s can be outlined in this slide here. The first and most important one really is there were jobs. Now, a lot of the countries that make up the British Commonwealth cannot be described as economically prosperous in 1950. So for a lot of people who were single and had no ties, as Mr. Suter outlined, they would have found that there were great opportunity, especially in certain areas. Now, certain employers, such as the NHS and London Transport, are really the leaders in hiring immigrant labor, and they recruited actively from the British Commonwealth to fill roles in an NHS that didn't have enough nurses, for instance, or in London Transport with developments in bus technology and developments in expansion of the tube, for instance, needed so many employees. The law that really gave them the right to come here was known as the British Nationality Act, and that was passed in 1948. And what the British Nationality Act gave were 800 million people in the Commonwealth the right to claim British citizenship. There were no real controls other than the fact that you lived in the Commonwealth and you could come over, that until 1962. After 1962, the British Nationality Act is tightened to say that unless you had a parent or grandparent that was born in Britain, you were not able to claim British citizenship. So let's just take myself, for instance. Obviously, I'm Canadian, but on my parents' side, on my dad's side, you have my dad and my grandparents who were born in Britain. So under the British Nationality Act, amended in 1962, I'm therefore able to come over here and work. All that said, between 1948 and 1962, the real rush of immigration was sort of Afro-Caribbean who came over to find jobs in British firms. Number three, and this can't be discounted, were the sort of ambition of people and the views of Britain. First and foremost, wages were better here, and anybody who looked at their career opportunities, let's say in the West Indies or in India, for instance, at the time, would see very obviously that life for them could be better if they had an education or they had a certain set of skills in Britain than it would be back home. A lot of these people would come over and work seasonably on farms and send money back home. With the British pound being worth so much, it was actually very economically profitable for them and their families to do so. I guess secondly, too, there was sort of the view of Britain, the mother country. There was some attachment, especially from people from colonies or former colonies where they had strong connections to Britain. A lot of people from Australia, a lot of people from South Africa, a lot of people from India come over because they have this view of Britain as the mother country, and there's sort of they feel an attachment to the country and want to come over once the British Nationality Act was passed. Number four is there's an acute shortage of labor. The economy picks up drastically by 1951, and a lower birth rate after the Second World War meant that there was a need for people to fill positions. There was, quite honestly, just lots of work. And lastly, encouragement. There was, in certain cases, especially in areas which needed nursing, I can think of the NHS in some northern cities, interest-free loans and housing given to encourage new immigrants to come here and work. So there were lots of reasons why people come they did, starting in the 1950s. Now, as Mr. Suter alluded to, there were contrasting experiences. For those people who got jobs, like the happy person here punching tickets on a local bus, life was good, wages were good, things were okay. But on the other hand, Britons, the white Britain, weren't necessarily used to nor happy with black people. Of course, there was a good degree of latent racism in Britain. This is, these people were coming from colonies we once owned, or so to speak, and therefore they viewed these people with sort of a suspicion or an intolerance, or I guess a degree of degradation that we can associate with America at the same time.
So this contrasting experience ended up turning into problems. Now, the key thing before we carry on is to understand there's not direct hate by every single member of the native British community. I think, as we've spoken before, Britain was predominantly white, and as such, ethnic stereotypes were the norm, were accepted, and in some cases encouraged. So there's a lot of latent racism, people who don't actively hate black people, and definitely won't use violence, but still hold relatively racist views, or racist views as we'll call them today, towards black people, their intelligence and their capabilities. And there is a smaller group, although and usually younger, who tend to hate and use force a little bit more. Now, the key issue is, if you are coming to a new country, you have no friends, no contacts, and no money, you are going to go to the relatively deep areas to live, where you already know that there are people from your background who you might know from home living to help you out with jobs, to help you out with accommodation, or just socially. This means that as increasing numbers of immigrants came over to Britain, they tend to coalesce in relatively poor areas, such as Notting Hill. Okay, areas where rent is cheap and there's already an Afro-Caribbean community, or areas in Birmingham or elsewhere in London, such as Tower Hamlets. This is a problem because white working class individuals also living in the same area find themselves increasingly threatened by the arrival of these ethnic minorities, particularly because the jobs that the black and Asian immigrants are going for, the low-skilled, relatively poorly paid jobs, are the ones which they are in competition with the white working classes. And we tend to see more racism from the white working classes than the middle classes in this area, mainly because the middle classes are not being threatened. They're not, the immigrants are not coming over becoming doctors and lawyers, threatening the jobs of the white middle classes. It's more that of the working classes. So as we see increasing numbers of ethnic minorities and immigrants from the Commonwealth countries arriving in these precise areas of Britain and precise areas of London in particular, we see increasing resentment from the indigenous native white working class. And this tension again is stoked by this competition for jobs, as we see it particularly as unions, so trade unions, organisations of workers actually encouraged this racism because they saw the immigrant labour as a threat. And additionally, different cultures, particularly Asian cultures, who have non-Christian religions, were seen as additionally alien because they practiced different beliefs or couldn't partake in traditional British social activities, often involving alcohol, and therefore viewed with a degree of suspicion. So we're looking at the emergence of immigrant communities not randomly. They don't just randomly turn up to Sutton. They can't afford to live in Kensington. But these precise areas where there's an existing white working class group, we see increasing tensions.
Now, these racial tensions are also stoked by the fact that a lot of immigrants start to settle for low-skilled jobs. And, you know, there becomes with the low-skilled jobs sort of a stereotype of immigrants. Oh, look at these people, you know, they're dumb, look, they're not working in, you know, the high-skilled jobs. Oh, these are the people who make our coffee, these are the people who run our convenience stores and so forth. And with that, the stereotypes start to perpetuate themselves. Not to mention the fact that these low-skilled jobs don't pay very well. So you have a situation where a lot of immigrants are living in overcrowded housing. And with that, the stereotype built. Oh, look at them, they're, you know, they're dirty, they're living in unskilled housing. And you know, one of the sad parts about all of this is the media really plays into the hand. They'll exaggerate reports of their lack of cleanliness, their crime, their sexual practices, their practices of arranged marriage, which seem foreign and uncommon, especially that's something particularly Asian groups. And what you get is a situation where Britons, being stoked by the media, being stoked, I guess, by what they see, which is people working in unskilled jobs, which is usually a factor of their own racial prejudices, start to accentuate this. And you get things such as no colored or no black signs being put up on places that are renting. Jobs, and you open up the Guardian on the weekend and you look in the help wanted section, there will be people who actually post blacks may need not apply in this case. And that, of course, wasn't necessarily something that was illegal at this point. It was something that it was done. And all of this creates a situation where you have very much an us versus them. Us being the traditional white British, them being the new immigrants, be they black from the Afro-Caribbean or be they Asian or whatnot. By the late 1950s as well, you also have a group of people in Britain tend to be known as the Teddy Boys. We'll come back to them as a sort of a cultural phenomenon later on, but you'll have the Teddy Boys beginning to attack black immigrants who they thought were taking their women. They used to, slogans common amongst the Teddy Boys were things like "Keep Britain White," and a lot of tension takes place and will lead to actually the worst case of rioting in probably in British history, really, up into the London riots of a few years back. The Notting Hill riots of 1958.
So, as mentioned before, areas where there's a large and increasing immigrant population and a traditional white group being pushed out, we find more and more tensions, and this is no more evident than Notting Hill. And for the last 7 or 8 years, up until the riots, Notting Hill was getting more and more like a powder keg, more and more potential for violence. And this is because the white populations were getting increasingly worried about the numbers of immigrants coming into their area, how that's changed the area, and the crime they believe that these immigrants brought along. Additionally, the black and Asian immigrants who are living predominantly in Notting Hill become increasingly upset, increasingly wary and bored almost of the levels of racism that they're being directed against them, and they become increasingly resistant within themselves as well. So this is just waiting for an explosion. Like all riots, like in the London riots, all it takes is a trigger, and then all the pent-up hatred, all the pent-up problems that have been existing for sometimes in years explode. And this happened in Notting Hill in August 1958, where after a fighting Nottingham, where there's between large numbers of white and black youths, which is in its own way, it's caused by the same sort of factors we've already mentioned. Notting Hill kicked off as well, and there's a massive riot between white, predominantly working class native residents, although many white individuals came from across London to take part in this, and the black community. And this is very much the white community instigating it. However, what's notable is the black community of Notting Hill also fought back, and it's been seen as evidence of an increasing anger and an increasing being fed up with the racism directed towards them. So even after the riots, we see increasing in the press, we see criticism of the black community and a lot of racial stereotypes about when looking for blame, who's to blame for these. And although both blacks and whites were arrested, the media tended to focus a lot more on the issue of immigration as a cause rather than white racism.
Well, one of the sad ironies I tend to find about a lot of racial issues, when there's a parallel to be drawn between what you learned about America in the last unit and Britain in this unit, is that it oftentimes there's a lack of political will at the top to deal with the fundamental issue of racism in the country, and such was the case here. Now, resentment among blacks really leads to the Notting Hill riots. The police will generally downplay the racial elements of the riot, but nevertheless, the reality of the situation was horrible, and it was real. The Notting Hill riots caused about 4,000 people to return to the Caribbean, and when these people returned back to the Caribbean, they report on their experiences of immigration in Britain, and the government and the media in these Caribbean countries is horrified, and I actually begin to launch official complaints toward the British government about the treatment of Afro-Caribbean people in Britain at the time. And the parallel I was talking about a minute ago is that, you know, it often took in the United States the criticism of the Russians to get the United States government to take the racial question seriously, and I guess much is the same here in Britain. It took the Notting Hill riots, and it took the people who went home after them to encourage their countries and their country's leader to make an official complaint to Britain before anything really begins to get done. Not to mention that, I mean, that wasn't just the whole thing, but immigrant groups at the same time start to become more organized. They start to put together groups which will fight for justice, better living and working conditions, and as a result, government policies are formed in the wake of the Notting Hill riots. Number one, in the 1962